I want to welcome everybody here. Thank you. It's a very nice crowd that we got this morning. I am Brad Carlson, Extension Educator with the University of Minnesota Extension. Guessing that most of you probably seen my face around. I've been around for quite a while. In fact, as I was telling a number of people, the very first Extension event I ever attended after I got hired, which is over 30 years ago, was in this very room. And actually probably relatively similar circumstances because it was dealing with a lot of the feedlot issues that were going on 30 years ago. And we had a manure management meeting here, and I remember Mike Schmidt and Dick Levins and Larry Jacobson were the speakers. I don't remember who else. But anyway, it's good to be back here 30 years later, I guess. So the meeting today is really targeted towards farmers and those involved in agriculture. We're really going to be focusing on nitrogen management. We of course will cover some of the things going on in Southeast right now because it's important to have some context with that respect. But we really are going to focus on what we all can be doing as an industry to address some of the issues and the concerns in this part of the state. And so we're going to try and really keep this thing positive. As I like to remind everybody, Extension's role is research and education and outreach, of course, which is what this meeting really is. We are not regulators. We are not responsible for what has or what will be in that world, in that realm, and that's not our role. So if those folks want to reach out regarding that aspect of this, it's kind of their job to do it, not ours in Extension. So that's not really what the focus is going to be here today. The materials that we are presenting this morning is kind of a I don't want to, probably a hodgepodge is a really bad word for it. It's really kind of a combination of some of the materials that we developed called nitrogensmart, which look at nitrogen behavior in the environment, university recommendations, and what they are, how they were developed, and why they are what they are. That's a small portion of what we're going to do. We also customized a lot of the content today to have some very Southeast Minnesota specific stuff relative to recommendations, research, and other pertinent topics. But the original nitrogensmart program is almost a decade old now, and it really kind of stemmed from some conversations between Minnesota Corn and Minnesota Ag Water Resources Center, together with Extension, looking at the whole issue of nitrogen and nitrates in water. The corn growers really looked at this as a challenge to the industry that we are going to have to address. We can't run away from it. The question becomes, how are we going to address it in a positive manner that works for us, instead of trying to be proactive on these issues and not sitting around and waiting for a bunch of regulation to happen. And so the educational program kind of evolved from there. And so it has been strongly supported right from the beginning from Minnesota Corn. In fact, I should say fully supported. And so we do thank them for helping with the development of these materials, and they're covering the expenses of the meeting today. Minnesota Ag Water Resources Center, Warren Formo is here, and he's going to be talking in just a little bit. Has also been a partner in these efforts. If you're not familiar with them, I'll let Warren say a little bit more about who they are. We do have various entities around the room. We're not really calling this a trade show, but they are partners in a lot of these efforts. As most of you can see, the agenda is very full today, and so we couldn't just bring everybody across, but we had various entities here who you may want to interact with on a personal level. Some related to county-specific SWCDs, which of course, if that's not your county, you probably don't need to be talking to them. But if it is your county, you very well might want to. And then some other folks too. I will bring them all across the front here just before lunch and let them just introduce themselves, and then you'll have the chance to interact with them. As I said, the agenda is very full. We actually don't have any breaks scheduled in here. It just didn't really fit. The restrooms are in the back. You know, please just quietly get up and go use them if you need to. If you want to come up and hit another roll or 2 or 3 or whatever that is, coffee, just do that as we go on throughout the morning. And we'll be breaking at lunchtime for lunch. So with that, this is kind of the agenda for the day. I did actually put the speakers on there this time around. We will be finishing the day with a farmer panel discussion of some folks talking about their experience working with kind of changing their practices to address some of the issues in the Southeast. So, all right, with that, I'm going to just jump into some of the background here. As I said, we really are going to focus on nitrogen management, but it's kind of important that we all at least kind of have a foundation of understanding about what's going on. I think the thing that really kind of starts all of this is the problem of methemoglobinemia. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. I've only said it about 200 times in the last few years. But this is what's often referred to as blue baby syndrome. Methemoglobinemia occurs because if nitrates get in your circulatory system, in your blood, they can rob your tissues of oxygen and basically turn your tissue blue. Now it turns out as adult humans, and most of us have enough bacteria and fauna in our guts that it processes that nitrate and moves it out in our waste stream. And so the incidence of adults being affected by this are extraordinarily rare. However, babies are born without any of that stuff in their stomachs. They pick that up as they crawl around and stick their fingers in their mouths and whatever through the first 6 months of life. And so the clean water, drinking water standard of 10 parts per million to prevent this problem was established a very long time ago. It goes back to 1963. Worth noting that predates the Federal Clean Water Act by 10 years. It predates the creation of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And so it's been around for quite a very long time. It was first documented in the medical journals in 1945 in Iowa. The Minnesota Department of Health first documented in Minnesota about 1950. And a lot of people do ask, well, what's natural or what would we have expected in pioneer times? Probably zero in most of our water, because we have perennial cover, and we're going to talk to you a little bit later and show you some data on perennial stuff, and we don't see a lot of nitrate loss with perennials, like trees and prairie grasses. Maybe surface water may have spiked up as high as 3 parts per million, depending on if a herd of buffalo had run through them or a flock of geese or something like that. But that's kind of what would be considered background levels or native levels of nitrates in water. Flash forward to that, or maybe bring it up to where things kind of stand in Minnesota. The state legislature passed the Groundwater Protection Act in 1989, looked at a number of aspects relative to drinking water in Minnesota. I think those of us that were around, and I see a lot of gray hair like mine who were around at that time, do recognize that probably the big focus at that time was pesticides. I think most of us remember all the discussion about atrazine and allichlor, metolachlor, simazine, metribuzin were the products that were particularly targeted with that. It did actually include nitrates and other contaminants in that. However, it had a pretty major focus at that time dealing with some of those pesticides, and we're not here to talk about pesticides, so I'm not going to talk about that a whole lot further. The other thing, though, that resulted from that Groundwater Protection Act in '89 is it set us on a course to develop our nitrogen best management practices. So a lot of the fundamental research that went on to develop what we consider best management practices, recommended practices in Minnesota, started roughly about 1990 after that legislation kicked in. And some of you will remember the old original BMP brochures that came out with the blue waves on the front. I actually was an intern working at the experiment station in Waseca, and I actually did a lot of the work with this, just pulling soil samples, not the important work, just the grunt work at that time. as I was 20 years old. However, I did work on a lot of this stuff in my younger days. A lot of that work I know, I remember particularly the Kalmus Farm in Winona County, the Lawler Farm here in Olmsted County, Foss Farm up in Goodhue County, were some of the primary places where a lot of that research went on. And so the other thing is, when it comes to nitrates and the Groundwater Protection Act, it really at that time called for action on nitrate through education and awareness. I mean, the thought was at that time, they weren't really sure how bad the problem was or how extensive it was. It was kind of like, well, let's just look at this and let's see what we can do with it over time. Bring that forward, I think most of you realize that the state has a environmental fee, sales tax fee, created a pool of funding that allowed us to start looking at other environmental issues. And so there was some thought coming into about a decade or so ago that it was time to revisit some of what was being brought forth in the Groundwater Protection Act, particularly with respect to nitrates, because a lot of the pesticide problems had kind of gone away. And so the Department of Ag convened a group that ended up developing what's called the Nitrogen Fertilizer Management Plan. So that's already now a decade old, but that is available, I think, still online if you want to take a look at it. And it kind of set in motion a process for being a little more quantitative on what the nitrate problem was in the state. And so as a result of this, they started doing, which I think a lot of you are familiar with, the township testing. They mailed out water sample bottles, and people could voluntarily send in their water samples. And it was just simply trying to get a handle on where the problems were and how bad they were, how extensive they were. And, one of the big things at that time is computer technology had really advanced a lot in the last 30 years, particularly the ability to use GIS. And so we were able to produce nice fancy maps like this one here that actually showed where we considered to have vulnerable resources. And you can see that they are kind of regional, although it's really no surprise to anybody that southeast Minnesota with the karst geology had a lot of that. Central Minnesota, where we have a lot of sandy soil. Those of you that travel up there realize how much irrigation there is in some of those parts of the state. What I think a lot of people don't realize is southwestern Minnesota actually has very similar soil situations to southeast. That's another separate topic we're not talking about today because we're not there. But it did kind of allow us to be a little quantitative regarding where the problems probably were and to try and isolate where we needed to be looking. So the Department of Ag developed a criteria on townships as far as the percentage of the land, cropland, that was falling on what they considered vulnerable, potentially vulnerable groundwater resources. And so that's either looking at a number of things. Water table would be one of them. Another one would be saturated hydraulic conductivity. That's how fast or how easy the water can move through the soil. And then shallow soils too, of course. And we know that we have a fair amount of that in some parts of the southeast also, where you don't have to go too particularly deep to hit limestone. Some of you who know me know that the first 17 years of my career, I was a county agent in Rice County. We had places in Rice County where we only had 2 feet of topsoil above limestone. So we know that kind of can occur anywhere throughout the southeast, kind of depending on where you're at. So they identified the townships for testing. And as I mentioned, those got sent out, the water test kits. And if they came back that there was over 10% of the samples that were returned were over 10 parts per million or above the safe standards, they kind of went back and did a more scientific evaluation, kind of quality control over the sample collection and so forth. And so, as it turns out, this is kind of what's considered the final map here, we see that most of the townships that had high levels kind of run on this ridge in the southeast. So when you get closer to the river, we know that it gets pretty rolling, and actually there's not a ton of farmland there. In a lot of places it's just forested. And once you get kind of towards the western side, it ends up getting, we have a lot deeper soils and we didn't find as widespread of a problems, but there certainly is this band that kind of runs on that transition between the heavy bluff country and the more flat open farmland. I would say, you know, even though this is the Southeast, you know, we didn't find problems everywhere we thought we were going to. As it turned out, the central part of Minnesota didn't have anywhere near the extent of problems that we thought we did, with most of them just kind of running right along the Mississippi River where we had sandy and shallow water tables. You know, and then Southwest is kind of its own deal because that's mostly public water supplies down there. So you can kind of see what the extent of that was, you know, in this region. So the Department of Ag kind of started on a course of looking at these townships with high levels and developing working groups in those townships to try and address some of those things. Now, it also kind of came forward that the larger mandate was to do something with public drinking water, and so they started looking at public water supplies. Now, that's either municipal or wells that serve a larger population. So occasionally you'll find a apartment building or a mobile home court or something that's serving a larger number of people. Those were evaluated for high nitrate levels also. And so they kind of investigated. You can kind of see where a lot of those places were, where they did find nitrates. And this is a map that's current as of just about a month and a half ago or 2 months ago, looking at where these areas are. Now, early in my career, we called these wellhead protection districts. The latest acronym is DWSMA, Drinking Water Supply Management Area. And so in essence, it's the amount of land that's the farmland or whatever land it is, I guess, that's surrounding where these public wells are. And so this is looking at where we have elevated nitrate numbers. Level 2 is kind of where we have either out of compliance or it's considered to be increasing in that risk. And so in those areas, and I think if you farm in those areas, you're probably aware of it. They have convened groups of farmers who manage the land, who farm the land in those drinking water management supply areas, to develop an action plan. And so that really pertains only specifically to the people who farm in those zones. You know, at this point, you know, we're still at the, you know, let's develop the plans and get them moved on. You know, eventually, you know, the kind of the what if, well, what happens if they don't go down and so forth. That's level 3. We're not at that point yet, but the rule does call for the commissioner of the Department of Agriculture to develop or produce what's called the Water Resource Protection Requirements Order, which basically is regulation or rules. But we're not at that point yet, so we don't have that to talk about, and when it is talked about, it'll be theirs and they can talk about it. I do want to talk just very briefly about surface water, and I think particularly we all know the interconnectedness between surface water and groundwater in southeast Minnesota. The Federal Clean Water Act came about in the early 1970s. You know, I think a lot of us recognize that are old enough that were around back then. There were a lot of really big issues with water quality back then. You know, things like Love Canal, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland caught on fire. You know, there was stuff like that. There was really kind of unregulated discharge from factories, wastewater treatment plants, and so forth. So the Clean Water Act, primarily when it came out, was focused on dealing with those concerns and issues. At the time in Minnesota, it was kind of felt that our DNR was primarily responsible for dealing with walleyes and white-tailed deer, not equipped to deal with pollution control laws, and so that's how in Minnesota we formed the Pollution Control Agency for the sake of taking the state delegation on these rules. And I know some people ask about why we have so many agencies involved in Minnesota. Just kind of saying the history of that. I'm not really here to say whether that's good, bad, or otherwise, but the Pollution Control Agency owes its existence to the Federal Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act. One thing that was not part of the Federal Clean Water Act was non-point source pollution, and so that's kind of all of us who live across the landscape. It was felt in the early 80s that most of the wastewater treatment issues, the industrial issues were dealt with. And so Congress kind of revamped the Federal Clean Water Act in the early 80s to deal with non-point source pollution. However, because of the millions and millions of acres, the tens or hundreds of thousands of landowners and farmers, they simply couldn't follow the same process that they followed with a factory or a wastewater treatment plant. And so the Federal Clean Water Act calls for education and voluntary action for dealing with its standards. And so technically the Federal Clean Water Act doesn't really have any teeth in it when it comes to dealing with non-point source pollution. It identifies the issues and delegates to the states to do something about it, but it kind of stops at that point. So flash forward that to the early 1990s. I think some of us recognize hypoxia as being a issue that kind of came to light. Historically in Minnesota, we have not considered nitrate to be a contaminant of surface waters. If you look at our clean water rules, chapter 7080 that defines contaminants, you actually won't even find nitrate in them. And the reason for that is historically phosphorus was really our major concern for degrading water quality. Phosphorus is the limiting nutrient in general for most of our surface waters, and there's already more nitrate there than whatever's living in the water can use. And so for every bit of phosphorus we put in the water, it grows algae, it grows weeds, it creates life. For every extra bit of nitrogen you put in, it doesn't really make any difference because there's not enough phosphorus to do anything with it. And so the focus has long been on phosphorus, to a somewhat of an extent sediments, because phosphorus and sediments do tend to go hand in hand. However, flash forward this to the 1990s when the issue of hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico came up. It caused us to start looking at nitrates a little bit differently. I'll explain hypoxia. Hypoxia, some people call it the dead zone, but that's just kind of a flippant term for it. Really, it's a scientific condition. If you can imagine, and I think everybody can, fresh water is much more conducive to life than salt water is. So anytime there's a river system that discharges fresh water into the salt water of the ocean, it creates an area that encourages life. There's things grow there. There's algae, there's zooplankton, then the fish come in and eat that, and so forth. And I think everybody also can recognize that rivers flow high in the spring and they flow low late in the summer. And so what happens in these zones where these major rivers reach the ocean is they create this area of abundant life that happens in April or May, and come August and September, the supply of all the fresh water and the nutrients that are running down that river shrinks, and it can't support the amount of life that grew there earlier in the year. And when that stuff can't be supported, some of it dies, and as it dies, it decomposes, and as it decomposes, it robs oxygen out of the water, and it turns hypoxic. So that is a condition that happens in every major river all around the globe, and it's been going on since the beginning of time. Okay, it's a natural phenomena. We'll have people say, well, we're going to eliminate hypoxia. Well, you can't. It's a natural phenomenon. It can't be eliminated. However, it was decided at that time that the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico was way bigger than it had been historically, and it was adversely impacting specifically the shrimping industry. and potentially other things. And so the EPA convened a working group to look at the issue, and their goal was to shrink the hypoxic zone back to what they considered to be the normal state of affairs versus this enlarged zone. As I said, you can't get rid of it. The goal was to shrink it back to what they thought it should be. And so the group put together this hypoxia action plan in 2008, and it called for a 45% reduction in the amount of nitrate running down the Mississippi River. It turns out, while phosphorus is the limiting nutrient for our fresh water, nitrate's the limiting nutrient in salt water. So the salts in the ocean actually have a lot of phosphorus in them. It was nitrate that was limiting, and so when you put nitrogen in the ocean, it actually encourages growth, and there's a little back and forth between it and phosphorus, but primarily nitrate was kind of ruled to be the culprit. As I said earlier, the Federal Clean Water Act did not have any teeth in it for the EPA to deal with this because it was a non-point issue, and so it was delegated to the states. And so each state in the Mississippi watershed was directed to develop what they call a nutrient reduction strategy, and that is a plan on how we are going to reduce the amount of nitrate going down the river by 45%. So in Minnesota, we have this plan was developed in 2014. It set up some benchmarks, one of which is this year in 2025. We were hoping to hit a 20% reduction by 2025. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. It does have the goal of 45% by the year 2040. What we've kind of discovered or through the monitoring efforts of the PCA and other sister agencies that work on this is we think we made some progress as far as reducing nitrate loads into the river. However, it's been kind of pun intended, washed away by all the increased rainfall that we've had over the last decade. So the total amount of nitrogen going down the river, if you just think of it in a tonnage perspective, is a factor of the concentration of the nitrogen, the nitrate in the water times the amount of water. The amount of nitrate in the water has gone down, but the amount of water has gone up. And so when you multiply them together, the total tonnage hasn't really changed all that much. It's a bad problem. In fact, I heard one researcher from Purdue described it as a wicked problem. It just seems like kind of a whack-a-mole. Every time you deal with something, a different problem raises its head. And so it's been very difficult, and we're working on it. So the state nutrient reduction strategy is being rewritten this year, and there will be a draft out later in the summer for you to comment on. So I've actually been serving on the technical advisory group for the rewriting of that. And this is a very recent map that was supplied to me by Dave Wall from the PCA, looking at the watersheds and how they are being prioritized. I guess it comes as no surprise that primarily we're looking at the corn and soybean country in the state. That's really, frankly, that's where we're finding the nutrients, and so that's where we're going to have to do the work. In Minnesota, we do this work on what we call HUC 8 watersheds. HUC stands for hydrologic unit code, and 8 means an 8-digit number. That's not really important to anybody here, but if you hear somebody say a HUC 8 watershed, that's what that means. And so these things are roughly speaking about the same size as a county. In Minnesota, we got 87 counties. I think there's 85 of these, 80, 85, I don't know, somewhere around. So roughly about the same number of these as we have counties in Minnesota. However, of course, they follow watershed boundaries. You got the Cannon up here, and we got the Root and the Zumbro and so forth. And so each of these watersheds has its own plan. And so these plans are written locally. Your soil and water conservation districts, in most cases, are the lead entity on developing these plans. We have them all the way across the state at this point in time. And they identify the resource concerns within those watersheds kind of as a grand sum total. And the nice thing about them, of course, is they are locally generated and locally administered. And so you all, as living here in this area, have the ability to be part of that process, to engage in that, to be part of the working groups and also to help prioritize with the resource concerns. And so these One Water plans are to be incorporating the objectives of the state's nutrient reduction strategy. They're looking at some of the issues relative to groundwater. Again, we've got groundwater connectedness in southeastern Minnesota, and other resource concerns such as erosion or other problems, maybe pesticides where they still occur, and some of those things too. And those are being handled locally. I guess the last point I want to make here on my little intro is that we have also had some focus on concentration of nitrate in water as it pertains to aquatic life. That is, I don't know if we really want to call it really settled science, but the Pollution Control Agency has identified nitrate concentration to be a particular concern in cold water ecosystems. The blue areas here show where all of those are in the state, and they have basically adopted the 10 part per million drinking water standard in those areas, kind of for lack of a better number, although Dave Wall actually from the PCA gave me this data just 2 days ago. You know, the studies are kind of indicating 8 might be kind of more likely what's causing issues in those streams. And so you can see anyone that's red are where we're exceeding the concentration standards. And so those are also places where there is going to be some increased emphasis in southeastern Minnesota. So with that, I'm going to bring up Warren Formo, because Warren's going to talk a little bit more about what's going on right now with some of these. This is more of the long-term history stuff of what's happened, you know, over the last 40 years. Warren's going to talk much more specifically about some of the things going on right now. So I'm going to switch to Warren's slides.
All right. Well, thank you, Brad, and thanks for everybody here for coming. I got to get that closer, I guess. So Brad gave a very good introduction here and an overview of some of the things that are happening relative to nitrates. And he had asked me to talk a little bit about some of the more recent happenings around nitrates in southeast Minnesota. And so, but before I get into that, just a little background of the Minnesota Ag Water Resource Center. We are a coalition of about 20 ag groups from across Minnesota. So it's the primary commodity organizations, includes Farm Bureau and Farmers Union, the Irrigators Association, Minnesota Crop Production Retailers. So pretty much all those agronomy and farm production centered organizations across the state. We were formed back in 2008, and our main purpose is to work with those groups all over the state, helping to identify and address water issues. So as you can imagine, it's different everywhere you go, which is one of the things I love about the work we do. Every day is kind of a different thing. Although I will say lately, a lot of days have been devoted to you folks in the southeast part of the state. We, as part of our program, we do a lot of summer field days and events and activities. We participate in many agency-led conversations, including those that led to some of the reports that Brad referenced on hypoxia and the nitrogen fertilizer plan and those sorts of things. Also, every February, we hold 2 nutrient conferences. They are co-hosted with the University of Minnesota and the Department of Agriculture. And there are 2. The first is, I think next year, we've just begun planning, I think next year's our 18th annual Nutrient Management Conference, which is general, includes phosphorus, potassium, micronutrients, all of those topics. And then the second one is the nitrogen, and I want to use the full name because this is important, even though we've debated how to make it shorter, Fabian. And our nitrogen-specific conference was the brainchild of Fabian Fernandez, and you're going to hear from Fabian later today. I think next year will be the 12th annual conference, or is it the 11th? 12th coming up. So we've been doing this for a while now, and I know I see many folks here who have attended those events. But our nitrogen-specific conference is called Nitrogen, Minnesota's Grand Challenge and Compelling Opportunity. It's long, but we can't shorten it because it's so on point with, as Brad talked about, the ag industry, farming organizations recognized quite a while ago that we need to continue to strive to be more efficient, use nutrients more efficiently, specifically nitrogen. And with all these relatively recent issues swirling around, it's become even more important. So with that, let me launch into some slides. First of all, we can't talk about recent happenings without talking about some things that happened over a longer period of time. And so when Brad talks about the southeast karst region and the issues we're having, it's important to know that nitrates in groundwater were recognized or were found at elevated levels decades ago. And there were different responses at that time to how they should be addressed. But for most, it wasn't considered to be a big problem. Even the agencies at that time were not aggressively addressing nitrates in groundwater. Brad talked a little bit about methemoglobinemia in general, but I want to give a little more context, specifically in Minnesota. Minnesota played a role in the development of those drinking water standards for infants back in the 1950s and 60s, in that in the late 40s and 50s, there were about 150 documented cases of blue baby syndrome or methemoglobinemia in Minnesota. A lot of them were in southwest Minnesota, but they were in other places, including southeast Minnesota as well. And Brad talked a little bit about some of the issues around nitrates in groundwater earlier. Of those 150 some cases, there were 14 deaths. I would say that was pretty tragic and a crisis and needed to be dealt with. And it was in that time, in that coming out of that era, as soon as that was recognized, our hospitals, our county public health systems began to very aggressively work with families, especially those with recent babies. If you were having children in that era, which my wife and I were, we lived on a private well in the country. Every time we were in the hospital to have a baby, before we went home, they went through a process that included a discussion about nitrates. And this was a long time ago. So there were definitely reasons why we have the 10 milligram per liter standard for infants. The other major area that changed during that time was that led to changes in how we drill wells, construct wells. Before that, many wells weren't even drilled. There were a lot of hand-dug wells. And after the 1950s, there was a new focus on well siting and well construction that ultimately led to our well code. When we talk about this region of the state, recently we're talking about 8 counties, and Brad mentioned Rice also has some karst, extends into even far southeastern Dakota County. What this map was supposed to show you is the areas that have been defined by the Department of Agriculture as vulnerable. And it largely overlays that area that Brad talked about where the well testing was done. What this map is supposed to show you is when the Department of Ag in 2019 passed and finalized the groundwater protection rule, which many of you remember that discussion, it ultimately led to the prohibition of fall commercial in those regions and kind of launched us in the direction of the private or the public well system around Duismas that Brad described. More recently, the Pollution Control Agency has come up with a map that's extremely close to this, maybe identical. I've not been able to compare them close enough. But that map applies to feedlots. So if you're an NPDES permitted feedlot, then you'll know that if you're applying manure on vulnerable soils, there are restrictions, and they're going to become more strict over the next couple of years with the new feedlot permit that requires that if you're going to apply fall manure, you need to do certain BMPs to mitigate potential nitrate losses. And so if you're a feedlot operator, you might have questions about that. But the main thing that I would like to show, which many of you know, is that of those 8 counties, 6 of them are pretty purple or pink, whatever color that is, with a lot of karst. But as we get over into Dodge and MAWRC County, the majority of those counties would not be shaded. And I think it's important when we think about BMP promotion and the research we're doing in agriculture that we recognize we really need to focus on those vulnerable soils, and they're not everywhere, even in this region, especially those 2 counties. So I just want to give a little background. Many of you know all of this already, but let's see, In April of 2023, a petition was filed with the EPA seeking their intervention to address groundwater issues in southeast Minnesota. That petition contends that elevated nitrate levels present what they describe as an imminent and substantial endangerment to health, or a crisis. They allege that the state agencies had failed to effectively address nitrate concerns, and they allege that large-scale livestock farms and row crops are the main contributors to this issue. I could opine for a long time on the various elements of this, and as could many of you, but this is the nuts and bolts of that petition that was filed. Specifically, the petition asks that EPA do these things: investigate ag land uses that are most likely driving the contamination. They would like to see responsible contaminators, that they provide a free and safe source of drinking water. They want to prohibit CAPOs, which is the permitted livestock operations, generally in Minnesota, those over 1,000 animal units. They want to prohibit those feedlot operations from either expanding or constructing new operations, and require public notice of manure applications. And this is out of the petition. So when you think about all of these things and how they might play out in agriculture, one of the concerns that I have is that corn production, soybean production, any crop we produce is not the same everywhere. And we've looked at a lot of data, and you're going to hear a lot more data throughout the day. We find farms with a wide range of nitrate losses, whether you're measuring through tile loss or with lysimeters below the soil surface. And sometimes you might point towards a trend that you think there's something there that indicates something about management, but not always. And so I guess my point is, it's a very complex, complicated system, and a simple regulatory one-size-fits-all approach, in my view, does not work. We need to fine-tune it and tailor it, and that's why I think many of you are here today, to learn more about things you can do on your farm to address nitrates, starting at home, but ultimately, as Brad suggested, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. So I've already mentioned that the well code, which has a lot to do with siting and construction of wells, was passed in Minnesota in 1974. Brad mentioned the township testing program and the fact that in those vulnerable areas of the several thousand wells that were tested, 12% did not meet the standard of 10 parts per million. 88% did. And if you take out those constructed before 1974, the number drops to about 5%. So I think all those things are important to know. So well construction has something to do with this. Well siting has something to do with this. And so I think it's important to recognize. I'd also point out that Minnesota already has some of the strictest livestock permit requirements in the country, and recent revisions make them even more so, and especially are targeted towards those vulnerable soils. And those will take effect in 2027. The groundwater protection rule, which is the Department of Ag's piece of this, was passed in 2019. So we're just a few years into that. And in my view, it's brought about some really good discussions in agriculture and some really good changes that I think will show up in the data as we go forward. So the state agencies, when they received that petition in April of 2023, in the fall, EPA responded to the state agencies and directed them to create a plan. And so in January of 2024, the state agencies announced these steps that they were going to take. Initially in the first 6 months, which we're well past now, but they have launched this program to do additional well testing. Many of you here may have received in the mail an invitation to apply for or order a well kit. I know I live in Goodhue County, so we're part of the footprint of this petition. And we had our well tested here about a month ago. No nitrates in our area. There were other things that were concerning, so we treat our water, always have, for them, but nothing relative to nitrates. So the plan was for the Department of Health to lead an effort to do more well testing, with priority, naturally, on those homes with infants, and providing alternate water sources for the most vulnerable, or we've also moved to having a treatment as an option. Midterm, that program will grow, and it will be on the focus of infants to all families, all people. And so everyone, and as I understand currently, everyone who lives in these 8 counties with a private well is eligible for the free water testing. And I think one of the best outcomes of that program for the Department of Health is that it's not specific to nitrate. They're testing for all 5 of the contaminants they generally recommend testing for. So that includes lead, arsenic, manganese, bacteria, and nitrates. And so you'll get information on all of those. If you haven't done it, you can just Google free well testing in southeast Minnesota, and you'll find a way to order that well kit, and you can send that sample in and get that information for yourself. The next step after that petition was filed and the agencies took those steps was that this past January, a lawsuit was filed against 2 state agencies, Pollution Control Agency and Department of Agriculture. And essentially, it repeats a lot of the same concerns that are in the petition that I mentioned, but it also does 2 specific things, or makes 2 specific requests. First, it wants to open up Minnesota's feedlot rules. The 70-20 is where Minnesota has feedlot rules. The feedlot rules apply to all feedlots, generally above 50 animal units. There's some instances where it can go lower, but generally above 50 animal units. So that's most feedlots. And they also seek to open up Minnesota's groundwater protection rule, which I indicated before is only 6 years old and applies primarily to drinking water supply management areas at this time. So they would like to see those 2 rulemaking processes opened up. It's important, I think, to note that relative to the feedlot rule, first of all, we just over the last year went through a revision of the feedlot permit requirements for large operations, and PCA PCA has announced that they intend to open up the 70-20 rules for discussion and new rulemaking, and that process will kick off next week. There's actually a webinar. You can Google that if you're interested. And that will begin the process of comments and about probably a 2-year process of back and forth with comments and negotiation and consideration and draft rules and then finalization of a rule eventually. So if you're interested and concerned about new rules relative to feedlots of between that 50 and 1,000 category, then I would encourage you to be checking that out. So one element of the lawsuit is already sort of cooked in that it's the PCA has already agreed to open up that rule. To my knowledge, to this point, the Department of Agriculture has not agreed to open up the groundwater protection rule, essentially saying that it's so new, it's just begun to take effect, we need to let it serve its intent and purpose for a period of time and then analyze where we're at some point in the future. One other piece of the state agency response was that a task force was created, or I should call it a work group, the Southeast Minnesota Nitrate Strategies Collaborative Work Group. And it is a very diverse group of about 19 people, quite a few of them here in the room today. They've been meeting monthly since last June or July. And the task of that group is to develop these shared understanding of nitrate issues in the region, try to build consensus around long-term nitrate reduction strategies, and develop strategies to accelerate mitigation activities. All things that I think the group has quickly come to consensus on several different areas where we can attempt to reduce nitrates in groundwater in southeast Minnesota. Just a couple that I'll summarize. The idea of cover crops, which many of you do, and there's a lot of good research showing that cover crops can reduce the amount of nitrates that escapes from the root zone. Another area is alternative crops. Could be small grains. It could be growing more perennials like alfalfa. There could be other crops that come along that would be potentially grown with less nitrogen inputs. There's also one strand of their discussion that includes alternative land uses, including land retirement, whether that's through a program like CRP, which you're all familiar with, pasture, rotational grazing, those kind of ideas. Anything that would kind of change and diversify what's being grown and produced on the landscape. And then the last area that the group is talking a lot about is how do we encourage more BMPs around nitrogen? And that could include things like making sure we're getting the rates right, the 4 R's, which many of you are aware of, getting timing right, the use of nitrogen stabilizers. All of those things are part of that general nutrient management discussion as well. And I think that's really where I want to end, with leading off into one of the goals of University Nutrient Management Team, nitrogensmart, our organization, all of you as farmers, is to try to figure out how can we continuously get better at the way we manage nitrogen. I think back to nitrogen management when I was a kid, before some of you were even born, and it has changed dramatically. And yet I often hear, we've got to get farmers to stop farming the way they did in the 70s and 80s. I haven't met that farmer. You guys all know, with the advances in precision technology, new planting equipment, there's just a whole long list of things that have helped you manage nitrogen better. And so I'm going to turn it back to Brad, and we're going to hear from a bunch of folks talking about those concepts today.